Hello and welcome to our Smarter Selling webinar. We're your hosts. I'm Ryan Patton.
And I'm Scott Winterton.
And we're really excited to be here to discuss developing a solid point of view. Now, we've designed these webinars to be concise and informative, and you'll find we packed a lot into the next 30 minutes. Also, because of the brief format, please don't hesitate to ask your questions or add comments along the way in the chat. We'll be actively monitoring and responding along the way as much as we can, and time permitting, we'll address as many questions as we can at the end of our session. Finally, you can also send your own questions or comments for that matter to our email at webinars@kahoy.com. So Scott, I understand we've prepared a special thank you gift. What are the folks getting today?
Absolutely. Today, we've prepared an advanced copy of our upcoming white paper, Top 5 POV Mistakes and How to Avoid Them. So Ryan, while we're on that topic, let's go ahead and dive into point of views.
Yeah, absolutely. So what do you think of when you hear point of view? Does the word opinion come to mind? Well, what about the word empathy? Now, Bill Bullard once said that the highest form of human knowledge is, in fact, empathy. Now, Scott, during our last webinar, we talked a lot about the opportunities that we worked together over the years. And interestingly enough, one of the most common themes we often saw when sellers were presenting their POV was just a general lack of empathy. Often it was clear that they struggled putting themselves in their customer's shoes and, being in the chair in the audience or on the other side of the webinar. And really, without empathy, their POV, even if well presented, would fall flat on the audience. Now, since we're heading into summer movie season, I'll liken our audience's experience to one of my favorite movies, which is Groundhog Day. So if you put yourself in the customer's shoes, they're experiencing and listening to 3, 4, 5 different vendors share their pitch and POV. And at the end of the week, they feel like they've relived each day over and over again without ever being able to distinguish one day or, frankly, one presentation from the next. So typically, they're seeing presentations with no plot, no conflict, no hero, no twist, or no positive ending, or some combination of those 5 things. So what do we mean when we say no plot? Well, in these situations, really, there's no compelling argument, no solution, nothing that inspires action for our audience. In these situations, these presentations will kick off with a list of tactical problems, oftentimes with no addressable so what, who cares for the economic buying audience. So Scott, in the situation where there is no plot to our POV, what's our solution?
So Ryan, since we're on that summer movie theme, let's talk about one of my favorite genres, the courtroom drama. So in every courtroom drama, you inevitably have this one scene where the attorney addresses the jury with some impassioned and super catchy summary of their claim. And as a seller, your point of view is an opportunity to do something very similar. You're presenting a case, you're presenting rhetorical argument for your audience to respond to. And so as you begin developing your point of view, ask yourself, what do I want my audience to believe? And then craft a 1 to 2 sentence summary of that claim.
I love that. So, pretty simple. Think of your POV as a rhetorical argument. Next, we have the issue of no conflict. Now, in these situations, our point of view isn't surprising, it's not educational, it's not challenging the status quo. These presentations typically dive right into the corporate pitch and sound like something like this. We've been providing these solutions for a decade and we're global and we have 20,000 dedicated employees. And frankly, I'm not going to tell you anything that you couldn't figure out by reading my company's About Us page. So, Scott, what do we do when there's no conflict?
So, Ryan, in our time together, we've seen scores of points of view, probably upwards of, say, 50. And I think you'd agree that the best ones were the ones where our sellers came up with something challenging or something fundamentally thought-provoking. Am I right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So as sellers, then, we should look for 3 to 4 unique themes that contribute the most to our customers' strategies and their idea of value, while also framing your solution in the best possible light. And in our white paper, we describe how uncovering financial, customer, operational or organizational implications of your customer's business can ultimately help you as a seller to create a challenging hypothesis, a healthy conflict for your customer.
All right, I like that. Really simple. Find those 3 to 4 unique key themes that really align to the customer strategy and are going to provide value. Pretty simple there. So next up, we have no hero. Now, when we talk about no hero, these POVs typically aren't customer centric, and rather they're product focused and feature function rich. But the features and functions aren't necessarily aligned in a meaningful way to the customer. And typically there's nothing identifying as is state versus to be state. So Scott, who is our hero in our POV?
So as a seller, there's a very simple starting point in finding the hero of your point of view. It's not you. So an effective point of view puts your customer, it puts their strategy, it puts their ambitions at the center. And some of the best points of view that we've seen in all of those POVs we've worked on were the ones where the seller took their champion's ideas and then they amplified them. In fact, we had one customer where the seller's champion was literally selling on behalf of the seller because she was so invested in the point of view that they created together.
Yeah, and it's such a powerful story. I mean, as a seller, of course, you want your customers selling on your behalf in their own 4 walls, which ultimately helps you win more deals. All right, so number 4 on the list, there's no twist. So in these situations, there's no unique positioning. And oftentimes we listed all the features and functions that we talked about earlier, but as the customer, I'm stuck actually guessing which of those things is unique to this particular vendor. Meanwhile, the POV missed on the opportunity to set competitive traps and help reinforce differentiation. So Scott, how do we address the no twist issue?
So Ryan, if we think about what makes a plot twist so powerful, so what made us gasp in that moment when we realized that, spoiler alert, Bruce Willis was dead the entire time. So we know that we need to challenge the status quo. We just established that earlier. But the best point of views actually move beyond the customer's stated or known needs, and they identify the unexpected or the unconsidered needs in a way that only the seller's solution can fulfill. And the absolute best of the best are the ones that use things like pattern interrupts or visual surprises to ultimately capture their customer's attention along the way.
And I hope that that's not a spoiler alert for our audience. If it is, they need to get out a little bit more and see a few more movies. All right, so last but not least, we have no positive ending. And in these situations, we're saying that we haven't identified value and aligned it to our key stakeholders. So Scott, how do we address this last issue?
So similar to the first point, before you design your point of view, ask yourself how you want your audience to think or behave differently as a result of what it is that you're showing them. And then outline what they can expect if they take your recommendation, as well as the idea of why they should change, how they should change, and then ultimately what they can expect when they do change. And so it's a lot like presenting a concept drawing so that your customer can see this potential positive outcome and then outlining the plans that they need in order to build it, in order to make it real. And since we're on the topic of building, I've got a question for you, Ryan. Did you take shop class in high school?
Interesting question. Yes, I did take shop class in high school.
Awesome. And did your stuff look as cool as what these kids are working on?
I have no idea what these kids are working on, but no, it definitely did not. I think it was a lot of woodworking, and none of my projects really turned out that great.
Yeah. So, and then was there any like one project that stands out?
I think this is the one that made me fail shop class, Scott. I had to create a coat rack, and embarrassingly enough, even though I got instructions for my coat rack, the knobs were all over the place. And I gave it to my mom. I'll never forget this. I gave it to my mom, and she loved it. She thought it was so great that she put it in the garage where none of our guests would ever walk by it. So I thanked her for putting it up, but clearly she didn't want anyone to see it.
We gotta bless mom. It's good enough for her to cherish it in her own little corner, but
Yeah.
not good enough for the guests. So the reason why I bring up shop class is because we've all heard that we need a point of view in sales, but sometimes actually building that point of view is a lot like Ryan's coat rack. So without an understanding of what we should include and what we should avoid in our point of view, the point of view is eventually going to just sit in our customer's metaphorical garage, unlikely to do much to advance the sale.
And Scott, real quick, I will say at least I got instructions for my coat rack. I wasn't great at actually following the instructions, but I think about some of the POVs that we've seen in the past, and there's really not a good instructional guidebook for the POVs.
Yep. The good news is that there is one now. So realistically speaking, though, I mean, there are tons of definitions for a point of view. Sometimes it's your take on the industry. Sometimes it's a clever way of saying your sales pitch. And in fact, Ryan and I had one VP that we worked with who had 4 different types of point of view that sellers were expected to produce throughout the sales cycle. And Ryan, I won't embarrass you by asking you to name all 4.
I couldn't name 2.
So our objective then of that point of view is to provide a perspective. And that perspective is rather than providing an effort to win over your customer to your perspective, that perspective that you provided the customer should actually give them an opportunity to challenge your point of view. You're ultimately, as a seller, presenting and testing a hypothesis based on what you know about the customer. And if you give your customer that opportunity to challenge your point of view, ultimately this is going to improve access, it's going to improve credibility, and it's going to improve trust with your customer. And so we talk a lot at Kahoy about this idea of blurring the lines between selling and discovery. And blurring the lines means taking on a consultative approach with your customer where each meeting, regardless of whether it's discovery or a presentation or a demo, is an opportunity to advance that point of view and to learn more about your customer. And so when you take that consultative approach, the next 2 elements are naturally going to follow. You're going to build credibility with your customer, and as a consequence, you're going to earn your customer's trust. So now that we've taken a look at the purpose of a point of view, let's dive into the anatomy of an effective point of view. So if the purpose of your point of view is to present a perspective for your customer to challenge, then it follows that our point of view should ultimately follow a structured and scientific approach. And so if you remember back in school, the scientific method, we research a topic, we present a hypothesis, we test it with an experiment, and then we draw conclusions based on the outcome of that test. And similarly, you're going to want to research your customer strategy, develop a hypothesis around it, test it, and then develop a new perspective or a new point of view based on your customer's reaction to your original perspective. And so in the case of that point of view, the whole research phase begins with an understanding of your customer's goals, their strategies, and their challenges. So Ryan, when we think about all of the times that we've talked to customers about this strategic understanding, what is the most common objection that you remember hearing?
Well, you mentioned the goals, strategies, challenges, and I would say, the most common objection was, hey, I don't know those things because I haven't been able to do discovery.
Yeah, exactly. So the good news is that if we're viewing that point of view as that scientific and iterative process, and we're blurring the lines, like we said, between selling and discovery, the good news about it is that you don't really necessarily need a ton of advanced information to put a point of view together. And to illustrate this, we've actually put together an example of what we call a conversation starter, where we do some initial research on our own, we come up with a hypothesis, and then we test that hypothesis with the customer in very early on conversation. And at Kahoy, this whole process typically starts with a strategy map. So in a strategy map, we make connections between your customers' goals, their strategies, and their challenges. And then we use that map as the basis for your point of view. And that point of view then is a concise set of claims that are specific, they're strategic, and ultimately they're actionable. So based on that strategy and map, we arrived at a specific claim. And your specific claim, just like we talked about at the beginning of our section on the top 5 mistakes, is to develop a 1 to 2 sentence statement that outlines what your entire argument is going to be about. So in this case, the customer, Coca-Cola, was investing very heavily in their data strategy to improve the consumer experience. And so we built our point of view around the idea of what we called intelligent profiles. And we also built a theme around our presentation that connected our idea to Coca-Cola's focus on delighting the consumer. And one final thing that I'll point out while we're on this slide is that in this case, we used Coca-Cola's branding, but sometimes our sellers, rather than using their customers' branding, want to use their own template. They want to use their own branding, their own design. Either approach is really fine. The important thing is that you're using things like eye-catching visuals, pattern interrupts along the way to keep your customer's attention as you present your point of view. And so what we did was we created a conflict and we created a provocative twist with 3 claims. So these claims were, again, specific 1 to 2 sentence statements that support the overall claim. And from a visual perspective, keeping in line with that idea of branding, we tried to stick with our original theme of really creating that delightful or summer barbecue kind of festive occasion within our presentation.
And, Scott, if you don't mind, I'll just say, hey, interrupt for a second. And I love this slide from the perspective of the way that this can become a more meaningful presentation even of the traditional agenda slide. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, that makes me think about some of the research that we've done where customers have actually told us that their least favorite part of your sales presentations are usually the first 15 minutes. And if you think about why, it's because this is the time when we spend going over introductions and the agenda. And the unfortunate truth of the matter is that it's typically also the time that we have our audience's attention at its utmost. And I guess furthermore, Ryan, how often have we seen senior executives in a meeting who only attend the first 30 minutes? And then the seller has just burned the first 15 of that 30 with content that has nothing to do with the point of view.
Yes, it's true. Well, as a solution engineer, ex-solution engineer, I can tell you that at many points when I started my demo, 30 minutes into the presentation, the executives were no longer in the room. So they missed all of my great storytelling. And I feel like we just saw an example of a customer that was using or starting their presentation with an agenda slide. So, it's not a good thing to lose those executives early on.
Yeah, and then probably the whole presentation probably went till about 7 minutes before the end of the presentation, and now you have to cram all of your demo in 7 minutes.
Yeah.
So I would even go so far to say as the agenda slide itself is largely useless unless you're in a really long meeting, like half a day or maybe even more. And so up to this point, we've shown how the point of view should be specific, it should be strategic. The last point is that it should be actionable. And so here you can see that we expanded on each of those 3 topics that we introduced in the previous slide. So we moved from possibilities to specific recommendations, actionable recommendations. And we made sure that our point of view was high level enough to inspire open dialogue in those early conversations, but it was also specific enough that our seller could use those claims to support a more detailed conversation, like a demo or a solution presentation, as they get further into the cycle. And one last thing that I'd point out is that with each of these chapters, you want to make sure that you're exploring the impact that your recommendation has on your customer and on their business. And so the idea here is to create that positive ending that we talked about earlier. So early on, you might just include impact in your talking points and then get the customer's perspective on how that recommendation ultimately is going to impact the business. But as you move further along, you'll probably want to hone in on a more specific business case, a more explicit value statement as part of that presentation. And so in those later stage presentations, we've actually been known to put those value statements directly on the slide alongside the claim so that they could realize that value. And so ultimately, you saw an example of one of our conversation starters. And that conversation starter, again, is an early point of view that was customer-centric, strategic, specific, and actionable. And as we conclude this point, we're going to go full circle on that customer-centric angle. So even as your point of view aligns with your customer and with their strategy, you need to make sure that you're resonating with the individual goals and the personal ambitions of your audience members. So now Ryan's going to walk us through how we can align our point of view specifically to our target personas and what they're interested in. So Ryan, go ahead.
Excellent. Thanks, Scott. And hey, appreciate you providing me really good instructions on how I can create my future POV. So now what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about, to Scott's point, how we can make sure our POV aligns to those target personas. Now, I want to take you back to kind of what we started with, which was empathy. And really looking at some research from Gartner around how our customers go through a B2B buying process. And so Gartner kind of found three key main facts as it pertains to how our customers are buying. So there's this idea of the 4 eyes principle, and you may have heard it, but the idea was there was checks and balances. Essentially, to make a decision, you needed 2 people or 4 eyes to make that decision. Well, what Gartner found is nowadays you actually need like 30 sets of eyeballs or 40 sets of eyeballs to actually make a decision in a B2B buying cycle. What's interesting is that this number has drastically increased over the past 2 years since COVID. Now, next, not surprisingly, you need to show impact in whatever it is that you're showcasing to the customer. What they found is that nothing significant is bought without a business case. Now, what was shocking to me with this statistic is that 7% of people either had no idea a business case was being created, or they just lied when they said they didn't need a business case. So what that's telling us is that we need to be able to speak our customers' love language. And when we think about love language, what we're saying is we're speaking the customer's language of value. So as we look at our C-suite, what we want to think about is all of those different key stakeholders that are the 14 to 20 odd people that are part of the buying cycle, and ultimately, who do they roll up to within the C-suite? And based on the organization's goals and strategies, what's those individual stakeholders in the C-suite, what's their love language that's going to be important to them? So, in this case, in our example, we might say our CHRO is concerned about a talent shortage, or our CRO, for example, actually cares about speed. So as we're thinking about the language of the C-suite, what we've done is we've put together a cheat sheet for you showing some of those more common love languages for the different roles in an organization. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, but it can be a good starting point. Now, remember, I said there were 3 kind of key rules of B2B buying. So the third one is that it's important not to make it complex for your customers to buy. It's for most people, and remember, we're selling to really smart people in these organizations, and they're trying to make a decision. and it's becoming increasingly difficult for them to distinguish your solution from your competitors. So it's important to include that memorable twist that we talked about earlier and help that that key stakeholder create a narrative for their project that allows them to more effectively convey a positive ending to everyone else in the organizations that's vying for limited funds, limited resources, etc. So let's look at how we can build our narrative looking at our customer example from earlier. So in this case, we were positioning this POV to our CMO, and kind of what we were saying is a 3-month improvement in campaign launch time. So we're going to improve employee experience through productivity. We also had AI improving the cost to serve and also creating a better employee experience. That led to a 7% increase in return on ad spend, of course, which is driving efficiency, which contributed to a 6 to 8% operating income growth goal. So let's look at how we can then help our marketing team create that narrative across the C-suite that helps increase the odds of getting funding for a project competing for really scarce capital. So this critical project is going to drive up customer satisfaction. We're going to create new consumption occasions, which increases contract profitability. Our VP of service really cares about customer satisfaction. Now, improved customer satisfaction means that customers are more engaged with the brand, of course, and they're more willing to be involved in helping drive innovative new products and services. And that's going to help increase competitive differentiation. So our development organization cares about more engaged customers, helping them create better, cooler products and solutions. And then, of course, our CEO cares about driving away competition. Now, employees are more engaged with the brand, and the CHRO, again, cares about that because that addresses the talent shortage. Knowing your customers helps drive forecasting accuracy. Our CFO cares about that. And then we built out this ideal customer profile, and that allows us to drive growth through more strategic approaches to build brand equity with customers, which ultimately gets our CEO really excited. So what we've done is we've essentially multi-threaded through the organization, and we have almost the entire C-suite interested and engaged in the outcomes of our project for our CMO and ultimately our POV as well. All right, so let's quickly recap. Over the course of this session, we've covered some of the major faux pas we've seen around POVs, and ultimately, Scott shared some great ideas on how to address those. Scott then took us through the anatomy of a great POV, and remember that a POV is that opportunity for your customer to be able to challenge and drive that discovery. And then we showed you how to help your customers create a narrative to address how enterprises actually make purchasing decisions. So with that, Scott, do you want to talk a little bit about how Kahoy can help our customers?
Sure, Ryan. So at Kahoy, we provide not only coaching, but also deliver customer-ready assets alongside that practical guidance to help you as a seller to capture and keep your customers' attention. And we do that by providing 3 core services. So with our best practice consulting service, we act as coaches to help you to prepare for your discovery, create your point of view, or be more prepared for your next demo or your next presentation. And then our conversation starter is where we deliver a lot of the elements that you saw today. And so with the conversation starter, we start with a consultation with your sales team. We deliver a point of view wireframe and recommended talking points. And then we build a customer-centric and branded presentation that ultimately your sales team can use as a template for their entire sales process. And then finally, our experience as a service offering is our full service solution. And this is where we combine strategic messaging, creative design, and then what we call branded environment to really craft those unforgettable experiences for your presentation audience in those must-win sorts of engagements. So with that said, thank you all for joining us today. As a reminder, don't forget to head over to the Smarter Selling blog and also check your inboxes for that advanced copy of our white paper, Top 5 Point of View Mistakes and how to avoid them. And finally, we hope to see you all at our next webinar planned for August. So that said, thank you all for your time.